EAA's webinars are made possible through the generous support of Aircraft Spruce and Specialty, serving homebuilders and EAA members since 1965. Tonight's webinar presentation is titled Buy or Walk Away, and our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. He's an author for numerous aviation publications. He holds a CFI certificate. He holds an A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization privileges. And in 2008, the FAA recognized Mike as Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year. Mike's a member of the EAA. Mike, thanks so much for volunteering your time to be with us and sharing this information with us tonight. I'm going to turn the control of the presentation over to you.
Good evening, Tim. Good evening, everybody. As Tim said, the title of tonight's webinar, and I've been doing this for 7 years too, I guess about the same length as Aircraft Spruce has been sponsoring them. Of course, I've been sponsoring Aircraft Spruce for longer than that. They've got quite a bit of my money. At any rate, the title of the webinar tonight is Buy or Walk Away. We're going to be talking about making aircraft purchase decisions. There's probably none of us who haven't spent hours looking at used aircraft ads. I used to have a subscription to a Trade-A-Plane, big yellow newsprint publication that was probably responsible for the death of a few forests. And I remember, spending hours scanning the pages, looking at all the airplanes for sale and thinking about whether any of them might be interesting to buy. Nowadays, most of us do this online at sites like Aircraft Shopper Online and Barnstormers and a number of other sites, including Trade-A-Plane Online. And of course, everybody is looking for the perfect airplane: low-time airframe, low-time engine, no corrosion, like new paint, interior, recent avionics, maybe ADS-B out at a bargain price. And of course, we're never going to find an airplane like that. And if you did find an airplane like that, common sense dictates that if the airplane looks perfect and is underpriced, there's probably some good reason, some skeleton in the closet that's responsible for the airplane's price. And sometimes it's in the logbook, sometimes it's not in the logbook. We do a lot of pre-buys in my company, and have found not a few airplanes with skeletons in the closet, with unreported history of accidents or gear ups or that sort of thing. Now, of course, these are extreme cases. Most airplanes that are up for sale are pretty reasonable aircraft, but it does underscore the importance of doing a very thorough pre-buy before you purchase an airplane, and having that pre-buy done by some trustworthy independent mechanic who doesn't have a prior relationship with the seller or the aircraft involved, and can give you an objective assessment of its condition. And when you do a pre-buy, you are going to find things wrong with the aircraft. There aren't any perfect aircraft out there. If you want a perfect aircraft, then you buy a brand new one and get a warranty with it. And even new aircraft are not perfect, but typically they come with warranties. Used aircraft do not. So what we're going to talk about tonight are some of the things that you will find on aircraft that you're purchasing, and how to react to these things like that, how to decide whether the problems that you find with an airplane are something that you can accept, or whether they're showstoppers that should cause you to walk away and go look for another kind of candidate aircraft. And we'll be talking about things like high time engine, high time airframe, older model aircraft, outdated avionics, worn paint interior, mechanical discrepancies, and just want to offer you some general remarks as to how you treat things like this and in making your decision as to whether to this airplane is a viable candidate to buy, or whether these problems are showstoppers that should cause you to walk in the other direction. Now, of all of these things that we tend to find on airplanes, the question of a high time engine is actually the easiest one to deal with, because in my view, finding an airplane to buy with a high time engine is actually a plus, not a minus. Now, most buyers don't look at it that way, and most buyers seem to be looking for aircraft with low engine time. But my view of things is that an airplane with a run-out engine is really very advantageous. First of all, when you buy an airplane with a high time engine, the engine hours are usually fully reflected in the selling price on a dollar for dollar basis. So if you buy an airplane with an engine that's at TBO or beyond, you can expect to be paying a price that fully reflects the cost of overhauling that engine. And so you'll be buying the airplane at a significantly lower price in anticipation of the fact that you're going to have to spend the money for the overhaul. Buying an airplane with a run-out engine actually reduces your risk, because if you buy an airplane with let's say a mid-time engine, you're spending a fair amount of money in anticipation that engine is going to make it to TBO. But you really have no way of knowing if it will make it to TBO, and you really don't have a very good way of figuring out how that aircraft was flown, how that engine was taken care of, what probability that engine has of making it to TBO or beyond. So you're spending money in anticipation of a certain amount of future service of that engine, but without any real assurance that you're going to get that. If you buy an aircraft with a run-out engine, an engine at or beyond TBO, then you're not spending any money in anticipation of future service of the engine. You fully expect to have to overhaul the engine shortly after you buy the aircraft. And should that engine go 300 or 400 or 500 hours past TBO, it's a windfall profit for you, as was the case when I bought my twin some years ago, 30 years ago. I bought it at TBO. I wound up flying it for another 500 hours before I overhauled the engine. Those were sort of free hours, if you will. And if I knew then what I know now, I would have flown it a whole lot longer than that before overhauling the engine. But back in those days, 30 years ago, I still bought into the notion that TBO had some validity. Now, of course, I feel differently, as those of you who have read my articles or have attended my webinars know. Another advantage of buying an airplane with a run-out engine, and this was certainly a factor when I bought my airplane, is that the seller of an aircraft with a run-out engine is usually a motivated seller. He's selling the airplane partly because he doesn't want to invest the money to overhaul that engine, which is a big chunk of change. And so that usually turns out to be advantageous to the buyer in negotiating a deal. So all in all, my feeling about it is that a high time engine, and especially a run out engine, an engine that's at or very close to or maybe even beyond TBO, is a real advantage when you're buying an airplane. And it should not discourage anybody in any way. In fact, it should be treated as a plus. Now, high time airframe is a little bit different than high time engines. Unlike an engine, you can't roll back the airframe time. you can't really overhaul the airframe, at least with any kind of economic practicality. So you're living with the airframe time that you're going to buy. Very high airframe time may or may not be a minus. Depends on what airplane you're buying. For example, the strut-braced Cessnas their airframes seem to be able to last forever. We know of quite a few strut-braced Cessnas that have upwards of 40,000 hours on them. And as long as those airframes have been kept corrosion free, to the best of my knowledge, there has never ever been an in-flight failure of a strut-braced Cessna airframe. The airframes basically last essentially forever. So high time airframe on a strut-braced Cessna is really not a problem as long as the airframe is corrosion free. And of course, that's one of the things that we need to look for quite diligently during a pre-buy, especially with Cessnas, because the legacy Cessnas were built with essentially no internal corrosion proofing, so they're very vulnerable to internal corrosion, and that's one of the big focuses of a pre-buy when you're buying a Cessna. On the other hand, some of the cantilever wing airframes, the strutless ones, can suffer structural fatigue issues that can become a big problem. This has been true, for example, of Bonanzas and Barons that have had issues with the wing spar carry-through structure on high-time airframes. True of other Beechcraft products like Twin Beaches and even King Airs. There have been issues with the Twin Cessnas, especially the 400 series Twin Cessnas. There's a very, very expensive spar AD that affects 400 series Cessna Twins with high time airframes. So that's an area where you have to kind of research the particular make and model of airplane that you're looking for to see whether it has aging airframe issues or not. Some make and model airplanes have problems in that area, some do not, and so it varies. At the same time, a very low time airframe can also be a minus. An aircraft with unusually low hours for its age is typically one that has endured lengthy periods of disuse, and airplanes don't like to endure periods of disuse. Airplanes like to fly, and if they sit around rather than flying, they frequently develop corrosion issues. And that's particularly true if the periods of disuse took place in a geographic area where there's a high corrosion risk. Florida is the one that always jumps out at me because an awful lot of airplanes that are for sale come from Florida. And we always shudder when a client brings a Florida-based airplane to us for pre-buy, unless that airplane has really flown a lot, because airplanes based in Florida just have a huge risk of hidden corrosion, and we've seen that again and again. And it's not just Florida; anything along the Gulf Coast has a very high corrosion risk. Galveston is just as bad as Florida. We've got a client in Puerto Rico that has terrible corrosion problems there. So if you're looking at an unusually low time airplane, it's important to consider where it's lived its life, and if it has lived its life in a high corrosion risk area, it might be an airplane that you should not consider, or at very least would require a very, very thorough corrosion inspection. In general, I would be more comfortable buying a 25-year-old airplane with 4,000 airframe hours than one with 1,000 airframe hours, because the 4,000 airframe hour airplane has been flying 160 hours a year. It's been quite active. The one with 1,000 airframe hours has probably done a lot of sitting around. If it was sitting around in Tucson, I wouldn't worry too much. If it was sitting around in Tampa, I would probably not even consider the airplane. So, the bottom line is don't pay a big premium for an ultra low time airframe. Airplanes with unusually low airframe time tend to command premium prices. My advice is to be a little suspicious of airplanes with unusually low airframe time, unless it's an exceptional circumstance and the airplane was, based in Arizona or New Mexico or Colorado or someplace where the corrosion risk is exceedingly low. A mid-time airframe with hours that are commensurate with its chronological age is usually the best thing to look for. And in general, we urge our clients to try to avoid buying aircraft from regions of high corrosion risk, because that's the biggest problem we see buying used airplanes is the risk of corrosion. And, it's funny, even airplanes that you wouldn't think you'd have to worry about that. Like, we do a lot of work with Cirruses, which are composite aircraft. And you wouldn't think that you'd have to be too worried about corrosion with a composite aircraft. But the Cirruses that we manage that live down in Florida frequently wind up having corroded flap tracks and various other things that are metal, even though it's a composite airplane. There are metal components, and they tend to suffer a lot from corrosion problems for airplanes that are based down there in the Gulf Coast. Older model aircraft, it's interesting. The market value of an airplane tends to drop fairly steeply with the calendar age of the aircraft. So for fairly simple aircraft, older ones can often be a great deal, as long as they're corrosion free. For complex aircraft, high performance retractables, twins, that sort of thing. On the other hand, older model ones can often become a disastrous money pit. Sometimes it's really hard to get parts for the older aircraft. Sometimes they suffer from various aging aircraft maladies. And almost always, if you get an old model aircraft, you're going to want to put quite a bit of money into upgrading the aircraft, avionics and that sort of thing. And by the time you're finished upgrading that older aircraft that you got for steel, you probably have invested more money in the aircraft than it's worth, because it's still an older aircraft and it still is going to have a low fair market value. So it's easy to get underwater in one of these aircraft. So, if you want to buy an older Cessna 150, like the 1959 Cessna 150 that I learned to fly in, I would not discourage you from doing so, especially if the airplane lived its life in a low corrosion risk area and has a nice clean airframe. If you want to buy an older Cessna 310 or Beech Baron or something like that, you might want to think twice about it. Unless you're an A&P looking for a project aircraft, I generally recommend to my clients to try to buy the latest model aircraft they can afford, and particularly to avoid aircraft that need a lot of refurbishment dollars put into it, other than the engine overhaul, which is fully reflected in the price. But if you spend a lot of refurbishment money other than engine overhaul and maybe paint interior, you're going to be putting that money into the aircraft, but it's not going to increase its resale value very much. So you can easily wind up getting underwater in it. Outdated avionics. I love that photo of that old narco super Homer. Believe it or not, I actually flew with one of those things in my very early days as a student pilot. It's kind of fun to look at those things now. Those are probably mostly gone now, but there is still a fair number of narco Mark 12s left in airplanes, which is that little lower photograph. Most aircraft are going to need avionics upgrades. The pace of avionics changes has been breathtaking recently. Of course, everybody knows that ADS-B out is mandated by January 1st, 2020. I'm in the process of trying to figure out what I'm going to do to meet the mandate. And it's getting really tough because the avionics shops are just all stacked up with work because everybody is having to install ADS-B out. Terrestrial nav aids are dying by attrition, and most navigation nowadays is being done by GPS. Precision approaches are being decommissioned in favor of WAS approaches. So we to do any kind of serious instrument flying, at least we almost always are going to have to spend some money upgrading the avionics. I still have quite a few of those round things in the panel of my airplane, but they're getting scarce now. Most airplanes that fly IFR nowadays look more like video games on the panel. Just all these wonderful big flat panel color displays, which is really cool stuff. But when you buy an older airplane, you got to think about the cost of doing that. So although we are almost always going to have to do some upgrading of avionics when we buy an airplane, it's still best to find an airplane with the most up-to-date avionics that you can find, because again, what you spend in avionics refurbishment is only going to be partially reflected in the resale value of the airplane. You're not going to get a dollar for dollar increase in resale value for the money you put in to upgrade the panel the way you do when you spend money on overhauling an engine. It's just not going to be fully reflected in the price. Installing a new autopilot is especially expensive. Although there is some hope on the horizon, there are a couple of companies with non-TSO'd autopilots, experimental autopilots that are working with the FAA to get STCs for installation in at least assembled certificated aircraft. So maybe the price of autopilots is going to come down, but at least right now it's quite expensive to update or replace or add an autopilot to an airplane. So it's finding an airplane that has a decent autopilot already installed is a big plus. Paint and interior, that's another one that my view about paint and interior is almost the same as my view about engines. Do not hesitate to buy a plane with worn paint or interior. It's in a way it's almost advantageous to do that. Inexperienced buyers tend to overvalue the cosmetics of the aircraft. What really counts is what's under the paint and beneath the carpets, but the cosmetics tends to have a disproportionately high effect on resale value. So if you find an airplane that is mechanically sound, but has paint and interior that are long in the tooth, you can often get a pretty good deal on it. And so I think a paint interior, the way I do engines, something that it wears out, has to get redone every decade or so, and the money you put into it, it tends to be fully reflected in the the market value of the aircraft. To me, it seems kind of logical that if I'm buying an airplane, I'd rather buy one with worn paint and interior and then get to choose what the paint scheme's going to be. Let my significant other choose what the interior is going to look like, rather than leave that to the seller who is getting rid of the airplane. So I think there's some real advantages in buying an aircraft with worn paint and interior at a suitably discounted price. And as I said, the condition of the paint and interior is usually fully reflected in the resale in the market value of the airplane. That brings us to the question of mechanical discrepancies. This is the stuff that we look for when we do a pre-buy. And we always find some stuff. Most aircraft have some mechanical issues that come up at pre-buy. But they needn't be showstoppers. And I've seen way too many deals fall through and good airplanes get away because of some silly thing that came up during the pre-buy that really shouldn't have been a showstopper, but was treated as a showstopper by an experienced buyer. When we find mechanical discrepancies during a pre-buy, we simply, ask the A&P to give us a written estimate of what it will cost to correct the discrepancies. And then we present those repair estimates to the seller and try to negotiate a price concession to cover the problems that were uncovered in the pre-buy. Now, the basic ground rules, of course, there's nothing in the regs about this, but the basic ground rules are that, as a buyer, you're entitled to expect the aircraft you buy to be airworthy. You're not entitled to expect it to be perfect. If you want it to be perfect, you need to buy a new airplane with a warranty. The warranty says if it's perfect, and if it's not, the manufacturer will make it right. But when we buy used airplanes, we're buying them as is without a warranty. But you should be entitled to an airworthy aircraft, if not a perfect one. So typically, the way it works is that the seller should be responsible for the cost of correcting any airworthiness discrepancies that are detected during the pre-buy. And the buyer would be responsible for dealing with any non-airworthiness discrepancies, any cosmetic discrepancies, and so on. When we manage a pre-buy, we put together a discrepancy list and then help the buyer figure out which of those discrepancies are ones that he should expect the seller to pay for and which ones he should expect to pay for. And then we go into a final negotiation to try to get the seller to agree to reduce the agreed to selling price by what the estimated amount to correct the airworthiness discrepancies are. And that seems like a fair way to do things. The main thing is don't let a good aircraft slip through your fingers because of a problem that's easy to fix. I once had the buyer of a Cessna 421 that was being sold for $500,000 walk away from the deal because two of the cylinders came up with low compression. The cost of replacing those two cylinders is about 1% of the sales price. It was just crazy to walk away from that airplane for that reason. It was a tiny little problem, and it was easily fixable. I also had a buyer of a Cirrus, $300,000 Cirrus, who was right on the verge of buying this airplane, and the deal fell through because the buyer and seller couldn't agree on whether the Bose headset would be included in the sale of the airplane or not. And, that's not just illogical, that's dumb. We don't want to be letting deals fall through for silly little reasons like that. It's really important to keep things in perspective. So the overall process that you go through is you search for an airplane. Once you find one that you're interested in, you research it, get all the information that you can about it. If it's still, we do extensive logbook reviews. We talked about the fact that you want to find out if there are any airworthiness directives, that sort of thing, that affect this airplane. You want to be as knowledgeable as you can about it. If it still looks like a viable candidate, then we do a thorough pre-buy exam and get a discrepancy list, try to figure out which of those discrepancies we want to ask the seller to pay for, go into a final negotiation, hopefully close the deal, and then do whatever refurbishment is necessary. And that's the process. So, Tim, that's about all I have. And why don't we just open up for Q&A?
Okay, Mike, let's jump into some questions here.
Do you have any?
Oh, yes, I have a bunch of questions. That's what I'm trying to do is I'm looking through them to see what's first. Okay. So let's start off with this one. William's just wondering, should I walk away from an aircraft with an IO-520D with the pending service bulletin possibly becoming an AD?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. How long you got? I could probably talk for about 3/4 of an hour on that because I've been deeply involved in this whole situation. I'll try to make it short because there are actually probably a few Lycoming people out there who could care less about this. Absolutely do not even think about walking away from an airplane like that. Look, first of all, that MSB, that mandatory service bulletin that Continental just came out with, is totally absurd. We had a long talk with the FAA last week. They were quite upset about Continental's coming out with that MSB. They are not going to issue an AD to mandate that MSB is written. They've asked Continental to go back to the drawing boards and come up with something more reasonable that will allow those camshaft gears to remain in service until the next time the engine is overhauled or the case is split for some other reason. Continental's going to do that. In the meantime, 5 of the groups that represent aircraft owners, AOPA, American Bonanza Society, the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association, the Twin Cessna Flyers, and my company have prepared a 10-page joint response that was sent to the FAA a couple of days ago. We're actually going to put it up on the web tonight and publish it tomorrow so that everybody could read it. That basically gave the FAA our feelings about this whole issue. We do not believe that there's any kind of an unsafe condition here that would warrant any sort of an AD. And we made a very, very thorough case about it. So, and the Continental has promised to come out with a heavily revised version of that service bulletin within either by Friday or Monday is when it's expected. That will walk back the compliance provisions pretty dramatically from what was in their mandatory service bulletin. And then at that point, the FAA will convene what's called a CARB, a Corrective Action Review Board, where representatives of the Atlanta ACO and the Engine Propeller Directorate all go behind closed doors in a smoke-filled room and consider all the evidence that they have, both from Continental and from us and so on, and make a decision as to whether they're going to propose an airworthiness directive or not, and if so, what they're going to propose. And at the end of that process, if the FAA decides to issue an AD, which I expect that they will, I just think hopefully it will be relatively painless. They'll publish a notice of proposed rulemaking that will be published in the Federal Register, and then we will have a period to comment on it that is nominally 30 days long, but is often extended to 60 or 90 days. And only after all of that happens will possibly an AD go to final rule. So there won't be any AD certainly before the fall at the earliest. We also...
Steve is asking, at what point in the buying process do you start talking price? Early at inquiry, during the mid pre-buy, or late after all the issues are surfaced?
Oh, well, normally the way it works is you have to, as a buyer, you have to make an offer and have it accepted by the seller, and then go under contract with the seller, what's called a conditional purchase sale agreement. And there's actually a very good specimen conditional purchase sale agreement somewhere on the AOPA site that we usually use as a model for that. And it's called a conditional purchase sale agreement because it's conditional upon the pre-buy. So you sign an agreement where you have an agreed to selling price conditional on the pre-buy. Then you do the pre-buy. The agreement, among other things, gives you permission to do the pre-buy because it's not your airplane, of course. And then at the completion of the pre-buy, you go back and renegotiate that agreed to price based on any airworthiness discrepancies that were found in the course of doing the pre-buy. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, and Gary's wondering, what's the typical cost range for a pre-buy of a single engine, home built, maybe like an RV7? Well,
I don't think we've ever done a pre-buy of an RV7. We managed quite a few of them, but I don't think we've ever done a pre-buy. But for an airplane, let's say like a Cessna 182 or something that I'm more familiar with, or a Cirrus SR-22 or something, we normally figure about 8 hours of labor to do a good thorough pre-buy on the airplane. We normally figure 10 if it's turbocharged Cirrus. RV is probably a little bit simpler, so maybe 6 hours, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. And of course, labor rates vary from one part of the country to another. We usually figure about $100 an hour, but if you do it in the San Francisco Bay Area, it might be higher than that. If you do it in Texas, it's probably lower than that. So it just depends on where in the country it is.
Okay. And Paul's asking, how do you look at value when there are missing logbooks?
Well, that's a really good question. And there isn't a good rule for that. First of all, it's important to understand what the regulatory implications of missing logbooks are. Because there are two ways of looking at the missing logbook question. One is a fair market value question. One is a regulatory question. From a regulatory standpoint, the regulation involved is FAR 91-417. I just happen to know it off the top of my head. That talks about what maintenance records an owner is required to keep and how long he's required to keep them. And from a regulatory standpoint, most maintenance records are only need to be kept for a maximum of 1 year. There are a few exceptions to that. The most notable exception is records of airworthiness directive compliance are supposed to be kept indefinitely. And transferred with the aircraft to the new owner. There are a couple of other kinds of records that are supposed to be kept indefinitely, although most of them don't apply to most of us. For example, records of time on any component that is required to be overhauled at a particular time. Well, in our case, we don't typically have any of those things because TBOs are a mere suggestion for Part 91 operators. There are some pressurized airplanes with life limits on their windshields, for example, a 10,000 hour windshield life limit. So records of how much time is on the windshield are the kind of thing that are supposed to be kept indefinitely. But most of our records are only required to be kept for 1 year. So in theory, from a regulatory standpoint, all of your maintenance record entries of repairs and alterations and preventive maintenance and even annual inspections are allowed to be thrown away after a year. The FAA doesn't require that they be kept. The market looks at it differently. The buyer of an airplane, unlike the FAA, would really like to see all the records of the aircraft from the time it rolled out of the door of the factory to the present. And so loss of logbooks is definitely going to create a loss of fair market value. How much fair market value is going to be lost is not an exact science because fair market value is kind of in the eye of the beholder. But an airplane with missing logbooks, could easily lose 20 to 30% of its fair market value if the logbooks are missing. That's one of the reasons that I always recommend to all of our, certainly all of our managed maintenance clients, we actually require it, that all maintenance records be scanned into digital form, so that if the physical logbooks are lost, the digital copies still exist. And there is no requirement, there is no legal difference between the physical logbooks and the scanned copy of them. And in fact, typically when people are buying an airplane, we provide them with scanned copies to do their research on, and we provide scanned copies to the mechanics to do their research when they're doing annual inspections and so on. Normally nobody has to see the originals other than the aircraft owner having them stored away in a nice safe place. Now, it is possible that if in the case of the loss of certain maintenance records, where you've lost track of airworthiness directive compliance, that it might be necessary to recomply with the airworthiness directive because you can't prove whether it was complied with originally or not. And if that's the case, then the cost of doing that would be would factor into the loss of fair market value of the aircraft. So it depends a little bit on a case by case basis. But I think as a general rule, you can kind of figure that an airplane with lost logbooks probably loses 20 or 30% of its fair market value.
Yeah, that's significant. I like your idea about scanning the logs, and most of us all now have a telephone in our pocket that takes pictures. We could just take pictures of the logs and save those in a nice file somewhere. That way, you always got those images. Great idea.
Yeah. Running them through a scanner is actually better. I've had people who've tried to photograph their logbooks with their phone, and it's winds up being a lot harder to read than putting it through a scanner. Actually, One of the easiest things to do if you don't want to scan it yourself is just take the things down to a local Kinko's or UPS store or something, and they'll do it for you.
Yeah,
I think they charge like $1 a page or something to scan. It's not horrible.
Hey, James is wondering what credentials are required by the FAA to do pre-buy inspections.
None. A pre-buy is a non-event as far as the FAA is concerned. It doesn't exist. It doesn't get logged. There is no definition of what is supposed to be included or not in a pre-buy. It can be whatever. Normally, the pre-buy is paid for by the buyer, and it's for the benefit of the buyer, and it can be as thorough or cursory as the buyer wishes it to be. When a buyer hires my company to manage a pre-buy, we make up a checklist of what we think should be included in the pre-buy, and we provide that to the pre-buy shop. But there is no standard of what should be covered on a pre-buy, and it's really up to the buyer and the mechanic that he chooses to do the pre-buy to figure out how much time to spend on it, how deep to go. Some people will tell you that the best pre-buy is a full annual inspection. I am not one of those people. I've actually got a webinar on pre-buys where I try to make the case that a pre-buy and an annual are two radically different things. We do things on pre-buys we don't do on annuals, and we do a lot of things on annuals that we wouldn't do in a pre-buy. So they're quite different. But there is no standard for it, and it doesn't exist from the FAA standpoint. You'll never find any reference to pre-buy anywhere in the regulations. You'll never find any definition of what a pre-buy should entail in the regulations. And at least when we do pre-buys, we try to avoid having anything put in the logbook. Because again, the pre-buy is something the buyer is doing, not the owner of the aircraft, but the buyer is doing for his own benefit. And it wouldn't be right for a buyer who doesn't own the airplane to do something that would wind up defacing, if you will, the logbooks of an airplane that he doesn't even own yet.
Andy's wondering, what are some of the deal breakers that would make you say no immediately and save time on your aircraft search?
Well, the number one deal breaker, it tends to be corrosion. Now, some corrosion is relatively easy to treat, but corrosion that is affecting primary structure of the aircraft very frequently it turns out to be uneconomical to repair. Plus, if we find significant corrosion somewhere, the probability that there may be other significant corrosion that we haven't found because it's buried too deep in the structure to see is pretty high. So I think corrosion is the number one deal breaker.
Okay. A few people have asked questions about corrosion protection then. So Walt and Larry combined question here. What if an airframe has been fully primed with paint or maybe treated with ACF 50? Would that airframe carry more value maybe?
Well, I don't know whether that's really reflected in fair market value, but it certainly would make a big difference in the likelihood of the thing corroding. And this varies all over the place. I mean, for example, I think I mentioned earlier, made a brief mention that the airplanes that Cessna built, at least the single engine airplanes that Cessna built prior to ending production in 1986, were built with essentially no internal corrosion proofing whatsoever. They were really built as throwaway airplanes. Cessna never expected them to stay in service more than 10 years. And of course, lots of them have been in service for 50 or 60 years now. But they did not do any internal corrosion proofing. The airplanes, built by Beech during that same time frame were much more thoroughly internally corrosion proofed. If you look in the tail cone of a Bonanza, you'll see lots of green zinc chromate. If you look in the tail cone of a legacy Cessna, all you'll see is shiny aluminum, or sometimes not so shiny aluminum. Cessna learned its lesson, and when they went back into production in 1994 in Independence, their airplanes went from the worst corrosion-proofed airplanes in the business to the best corrosion-proofed airplanes in the business. And every piece of aluminum that goes onto one of the newer Cessnas has been dipped in a tank of epoxy primer before it's even riveted on the airplane. Those things have superb corrosion proofing, but the older Cessnas, including the one I fly, have very, very little internal corrosion proofing. Um, corrosion preventive compounds like ACF 50, Corrosion X are a very, very good idea, particularly if the airplane is based in an area of moderate to high corrosion risk. But whether an airplane that says in the trade a plane ad regularly treated with ACF 50 would increase its fair market value, I'm a little skeptical of that, but it certainly would be a plus if you were looking for an airplane. I think it would be very positive, and it would also generally sort of convey the notion that the previous guy who owned it actually, tried to take good care of it.
Okay, James is wondering, are listed engine compression numbers a good indicator of cylinder wear or engine wear?
Well, he must have not listened to very many of my webinars, because most people who have followed my stuff know that I'm pretty contemptuous of the value of compression numbers. The best way to determine the condition of cylinders by far is borescope inspection. We insist on doing a thorough borescope inspection every time we do a pre-buy, and you should do that as well. Compression numbers can be all over the place. They often aren't particularly meaningful. Borescope inspection is by far the best way to determine the condition of cylinders, and actually other parts of the engine too. Because if we stick a borescope in the cylinder and we see a bunch of rust pits in the cylinder walls, we can be pretty sure that the camshaft and stuff have been affected by corrosion. So yeah, I'm a big fan of doing borescope inspections. We always do that at every pre-buy. For airplanes that have been inactive and live in a fairly high corrosion risk area, if it's a Continental engine or one of the Lycoming H2AD engines that have barrel style lifters where you can actually pull the lifters and inspect the cam lobes, we will often do that during a pre-buy. Most Lycomings have mushroom style lifters, so you can't pull the lifters without splitting the case. But most Continental engines and a few Lycoming engines have lifters that can be pulled, and we will often pull a bunch of lifters during the pre-buy if we are real concerned about engine corrosion and want to take a look at the cam.
Okay. So Tommy's wondering, how concerning is a record of a gear up landing repair? I seem to come across this regularly when researching retractable gear planes.
It's not really a big deal. It does tend to reduce the fair market value of the airplane, which actually can be an advantage as if you're a buyer. Most gear up landings basically require a new prop and a post-prop strike engine teardown, and tend to do relatively little damage to the airframe. Sometimes amazingly little damage to the airframe. So, typically after the prop is replaced and the engine goes through its teardown, which is actually a positive thing because it goes back together with all new main bearings and rod bearings and a bunch of other stuff. The engine the aircraft tends to be better than new. Now, if it was a spectacular gear up landing in which the airplane got significantly bent, that might be another story. But most gear up landings are relatively uneventful. In fact, usually if an airplane gets damaged in a gear up landing, it's not in the gear up landing. It's in the rush to extract it off the runway. People will send forklift trucks and stuff out there, and we've seen a lot of aircraft that have had some sort of a problem on the runway get severely damaged by the people who are trying to remove it from the runway. But generally, the gear up landing doesn't do very much damage at all.
Okay, and just following on with that, John's wondering about any suggestions on damage history in general.
Well, again, the damage history tends to depress the fair market value of the aircraft frequently without good cause, because if the damage was properly repaired, then the airplane it should be as good as new, or sometimes even better than new. One of the things that I think is worth mentioning is one of the very first things you want to do when you're researching an airplane is to go online and order the FAA CD from the aircraft registry in Oklahoma City. They charge some nominal amount. They send you a CD-ROM with basically every record they have of that aircraft, and those records, among other things, will include all of the Form 337s that they have for major repairs and major alterations to the aircraft. And all of that's public information, so you don't have to own the airplane to order the CD. All you need to do is have an N number, and you can order the CD. So if you're interested in an airplane, that's one of the first things you want to do is get the CD from the FAA and take a look at what major repairs are on file for that aircraft.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Hey, just let you know that you're not alone. Mark commented, he said, well, my Windows 10 computer just crashed also. I missed the last 5 to 8 minutes, but I'm back now.
Oh, my goodness. Maybe there's something happening.
Well, I noticed at work today, my computer was awfully slow. And I don't know what it was, but that was awfully slow. It was just terrible. Okay, so back to it here. Phil is wondering, if interested in an aircraft that is a far distance away, how do you get a reasonable inspection? Are there services that can do inspections before you buy?
Absolutely. Well, that's one of the things that my company does is we have a national pre-buy program, and if somebody hires us to manage a pre-buy, we'll start off getting the maintenance records and going through a full logbook review. If we still think the airplane is a viable purchase candidate after we've done the logbook review, and it's surprising how much you can tell about an airplane by reviewing the maintenance records, we'll then find a trustworthy shop, typically somewhere close by, but not on the field where the airplane's based, because we don't want to use a shop that has any connection with the owner of the aircraft, and arrange to have a pre-buy done there. And then when the discrepancy list comes back, we go through the discrepancy list with the buyer and discuss what the significance of those discrepancies are, whether we think the airplane is still worth buying, and if so, what kind of price concessions the buyer should be asking of the seller before closing the deal. So there are probably other people that offer a similar service, but yeah, my company Savvy does that. And if you go to savvyaviation.com, there's a whole section on our pre-buy service.
Okay.
I don't usually toot my own horn, but thank you very much for making me do that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, a lot of the people that are listening tonight are probably listening because they're thinking about buying or selling. So it's good to know that there's services out there like yours that commonly do this all over the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's this is a problem that didn't used to exist, because I mean, back in the day when I bought an airplane and found it, on Trade a Plane, everything was kind of local, and we normally wouldn't even look at an airplane that was beyond striking distance of where we lived. But now, with all people search for airplanes on the internet, and you're looking at airplanes from all over the place, and most of the ones that you find are going to be some distance away. So the problem, is, how do you find a good shop to do the pre-buy, and how do you handle logistics of doing it and getting it test flown and all the stuff you need to do? So that's Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to go into the next question. Go ahead and finish the answer.
No. I'm finished. Go ahead.
Okay. Christopher is just wondering how you would think about considering an aircraft with run-out props.
Well, again, that's an even easier question because we normally recommend against overhauling props at TBO. That's one of those TBOs that I think really doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Props on my airplane haven't been off the airplane in, I don't know, 20 some odd years.
Wow.
Okay. I'm an on-condition guy, not a TBO guy.
Yeah. Eddie's wondering, how about pricing ADSB out upgrade, i.e. should the seller install or should the buyer install? What are your thoughts on that?
No, the buyer should install it. It's not an airworthiness item, and it won't even be an airworthiness item after January 1st, 2020. You can't, it doesn't, an airplane, not the ADSB mandate does not affect everybody. It only affects people who are flying airplanes with electrical systems who want to fly above 10,000 feet or in Class B or C airspace. So no, that's not something that one would expect the seller to pay for. That's a buyer thing.
Okay, and Michael's wondering, what about aircraft with a MOGAS SDC? Does that concern you?
Why would it concern me? It's just a piece of paper giving permission to operate on MOGAS. Incidentally, I wasn't aware of it, but until recently. But since I think 2012, Lycoming has approved the use of MOGAS in a pretty wide range of its engines without the benefit of an STC. That's something I wasn't aware of before. But our experience with people who have been operating eligible engines, that is low compression engines on auto fuel, has been just fine. In fact, there are an awful lot of advantages to operating an engine on unleaded fuel.
Okay. And Brendan's wondering, currently considering a Citabria purchase with wood spars. Do you have any comments on wood spar aircraft?
No, that one is outside of my area of expertise. However, there is a brand new, rather nasty AD on the Citabria that I just saw come across last week, having to do with problems at the aileron hinges and mandating an aileron hinge inspection and prohibiting aerobatic flight until the inspection is done and stuff. So if you're looking at Citabria, you want to get your hands on that AD and get smart about it.
Yeah, and Mark's wondering, anything different to think about in looking to buy an airplane out of Canada if I live in the U.S.?
No, that's done pretty commonly. The maintenance regulations in Canada are actually stricter than they are in the U.S. So it's pretty easy to bring a Canadian airplane into the U.S. It's a little harder to go the other way because Canada has various maintenance requirements that do not exist in the U.S. So sometimes you have to do extra stuff to get an airplane to pass Canadian airworthiness standards. But no, it's relatively straightforward to import an aircraft from Canada into the U.S.
Okay, and Michael's got a question here. Looking at an aircraft that has had modifications, but no 337s to document those modifications. Can this be corrected?
Yeah, well, first of all, you have to establish, I'm actually doing a webinar on this coming up in a couple months. You first have to establish whether those modifications are major alterations or minor alterations. If they're minor alterations, it's not a problem. It's just taken care of with a logbook entry. But even if it's major alterations and you can't find the 337, and again, if you can't find the 337 in the maintenance records, it's still possible that the FAA has one. It may be that normally when the 337 is completed, one copy goes to the owner to go into the maintenance records, and another copy goes to the FAA to go on file at Oklahoma City. So even if the owner lost it, maybe the FAA still has it, and you can find that out by getting the CD on it. But let's say there was a major alteration and there was no Form 337 ever written on it. That happens more frequently than you might expect. I mean, for example, an awful lot of airplanes have Rosen sun visors installed. Rosen sun visors are installed pursuant to an STC and therefore are considered major alterations and require Form 337. But I bet you half the Rosen sun visors in the world got installed without anybody filling out a 337. So it's not uncommon for an airplane to get Rosen sun visors installed, and then 10 years later, some sharp IA picks up on it during an annual and says, hey, where's the 337 for your Rosen sun visors? Oops, there isn't any. Easy to correct. The IA just inspects the installation and writes up a 337. I've even seen quite a few cases where an IA will write up a 337 that says that such and such was installed pursuant to such and such an STC on date unknown by persons unknown, signed off by this IA. So yes, it's definitely a remediable situation. It just needs to be inspected by an IA and the Form 337 that is missing. One has to be created and filed with the FAA.
That could get expensive, though, if you buy an aircraft and don't realize it until after you bought it. And if there's a number of these modifications that need doing, doing that sort of paperwork by an IA sometimes might get rather expensive. Wouldn't you think so?
Well, the paperwork doesn't take that long. The question is, how much work does the IA have to do to verify that the installation was done properly? If it's a set of Rosen sun visors, it'd take about 15 minutes. But if it was something like a leading edge cuff or a set of vortex generators or something more complicated, then he might have to spend a fair amount of time inspecting it in order to verify that it was okay, because the IA is now kind of taking responsibility for the installation that somebody else did and didn't document.
Yeah. Robert's wondering, are ad logs a good maintenance record? Would you recommend them?
I absolutely recommend them, and I use them for my own airplane.
And Fran is wondering, as a seller of a Cessna R 172K with fresh Garmin 650 suite, how do I come? Yeah. How do I come up with a price for a friend that I am guiding?
I'm not quite following the question. Is the friend the owner and selling the airplane?
Well, Fran is selling a Cessna R172K with a fresh Garmin 650 suite. How do I come up with a price? Let's leave it there. What are good ways to price aircraft?
Well, there are a couple of different ways to do it. One, probably the best way is to hire a local aircraft appraiser. There's something called the American Aircraft Appraisal Association. They have a website and they have a big directory of aircraft appraisers, and so you can hire a local aircraft appraiser who will look at the aircraft, look at the maintenance records, and give you a written appraisal, which would probably be helpful if you're selling to a friend, so that everybody understands that this is a fair deal. The other way to do it is to just look a lot of ads for similar aircraft on Aircraft Shopper online and Trade a Plane and so on, and use that sort of as a guide for what these things are going for. But if this sounds like sort of an over improved airplane that probably doesn't have any real comparables. So probably the best route would be to hire an aircraft appraiser and have him write an appraisal on it. For an airplane like that, they wouldn't charge that much to do it.
We've had a number of people ask about antique or older vintage type aircraft. Particularly, Austin is wondering, any particular advice on something like a 1956 Cessna 180 types of things you want to look for on a pre-buy?
Yeah, antiques are not my forte, but I wouldn't really consider that Cessna 180 to be particularly an antique. It's it's kind of standard Cessna. It's one of those things where you do have to look really carefully for corrosion because, as I said, those Cessnas were built with essentially no internal corrosion proofing. But if it's a clean airplane from a corrosion standpoint, it's probably a pretty low risk deal. Those airplanes are still well supported. Parts are still available for them. They use standard engines, Continental 470 engines. Nothing exotic about them at all.
Okay. Hey, Jeff just wanted to comment. He said, "Hi, Mike. I enjoyed your presentation last Friday."
Oh yeah, at the AOPA regional fly-in in Camarillo.
Wonderful. And then he's got a question here. He's following on. He's looking at a Mooney M20E, wondering if there's any downside with the airframe. It has about 4,500 hours total time. Does that time concern you on a Mooney?
No, I mean that seems. I don't know what year was it.
They didn't give the year. The
okay,
M20E.
that's 4,000 hours ish. 4,000 or 5,000 hours is kind of typical for what airplanes like that are going to have. That sounds like pretty standard number of hours that means the airplane was used fairly regularly and so on. That doesn't sound. It's certainly isn't a high time Mooney. It's kind of a normal time Mooney. Sounds like.
Yeah. Hey, Paul's given a good comment here. See, the type clubs can be a really good source of information when dealing with older aircraft.
Absolutely. I know there was a Cessna 180 question. I know in the case of Cessnas, the Cessna Pilots Association actually publishes buyer's guides. I don't think they do specifically for the 180. I know they have one for the 172, 182, 210s that are very, very good. I think the books are about $25 a piece, and they're really quite good. They go through the entire model history of the aircraft, what year various features got added. They have very, very good pre-buy checklists and the lists of the things most often missed during inspection and so on. So, and there are probably similar resources available on other makes and models from other type clubs. I know the American Banana Society has some pretty good stuff.
Cool. Okay, Paul's wondering if the interior was refurbished and there's no burn data or log entry, is that a walk away? Must be on the upholstery, I think. Probably burn data from the upholstery.
I wouldn't think that would be a walk away. The very worst comes to the worst. You cut a little swatch of fabric from some hidden area under the seat and you send it off for burn testing. I wouldn't think that would be a walk away. It's easy to remedy. Obviously, if it flunked the burn testing, then that might be a different deal. But again, even under those circumstances, it was not necessarily a walk away. It's just to say, well, heck, this upholstery doesn't meet specs. I'm going to have to redo it. I want you to drop the price. And then, if of course the seller says, no, I'm not willing to drop the price, then maybe it's a walk away. But
Yeah. All right. Well, looks like we're getting close to the end here. Let's just get a couple more real quick in here. Michael's just wondering, does your pre-buy service, he's thinking about buying an aircraft outside the country. Would you be able to do a pre-buy on an aircraft outside the country?
Well, it kind of depends where. It depends whether we have access to decent shops. We do, for example, have a number of shops we work with in the UK, a couple of that we work with in Europe, a couple that we work with in Australia. If it was in Africa or South America, we might be a little hard pressed. Probably the best thing would be for him to send me an inquiry, and I can give me the details of it, and I can let him know if we can help or not.
All right. Hey, Jeffrey wants to know, do you still like Phillips 20W50 as your preferred multi-grade and Aeroshell W100 single grade?
Affirmative.
All right. Hey, okay, so let's do the last question here. John's wondering, opinions on purchasing a high-time Piper Tomahawk PA-38. Are there any economics to add in the STC to upgrade the spar?
That one is above my pay grade. I don't think I've ever had occasion to deal with the Tomahawk, and I don't. I'm really not the right guy to answer that question. That sounds like a really good type club question to me.
There you go. All right. Well, we've got the end here, so why don't you go ahead and take a moment and share closing comments with everybody.
Okay, well, it's kind of the usual stuff. If you're not already on my list, I would invite you to sign up, put yourself on the email list at savvyaviation.com. There's a little red button at the top of the screen that says sign up for the mailing list, or during the post-webinar survey that Tim's going to put up, there's a checkbox that you can check. That email list, by the way, is not only used for the e-newsletter, but for example, over the past weeks, I've been sending out special bulletins covering this thing that's going on with the Continental crankshaft gear mandatory service bulletin and threatened AD, and keeping people up to date on that. So it's a good list to be on, I think. My book manifesto is available at Amazon. If you haven't seen it, it's still rated at 4.8 stars or something like that. I'm presently working on my second book on engines, and hope to have it out by the end of the year. And if you're interested in supporting that effort, you might want to visit my page on Patreon. Patreon.com/SavvyAviator. Upcoming webinars for the next 3 months. In June, the webinar is titled Major or Minor, talking about alterations and when they're major, when they're minor, when they need a field approval, and how to make sure you get your approval. The July webinar will be on borescopes, both how to use them for inspection and discussing some of the new borescopes that are remarkably good and remarkably cheap, to the point where just about every aircraft owner probably ought to consider buying one. And on August, and I'm going to blindside you on this one, Tim. I put down August 9th because the first Wednesday of the month is right after AirVenture, and I probably will have a head full of cottage cheese on August 2nd. So if with your permission, I would like that one to be on August 9th instead.
August 9th, so I'll put it on the schedule.
So that we get a little bit of time to recover. I'll be doing a webinar about the Rotax 912 engine called Outside the Box, because the 912 is a very different beast than the Continentals and Lycomings that a lot of us grew up with. And that's all I have.
Fantastic.
Thanks for everybody sticking around through my computer emergency here.
Yeah, thanks for persevering through that. Good luck with that. I hope it doesn't happen again for you. Well, I'm looking forward to your upcoming webinars, Mike. Thank you so much. When you get a chance, send me that description for the Rotax 912-1. And gee whiz, everybody. Thanks a lot for sticking with us tonight and tuning in to tonight's webinar. I hope you can tune in next week. Remember, we got 2 of them, both Wednesday and Thursday. So have a great night, everybody. See you next time.
Good night, everybody. Thanks.